Soulfire by Chaz Harris. Chapter 1, The £50 Prank. £50 was all it took to end a childhood. It was the 13th of December, the last day of school before the Christmas break, and George was the first to arrive. After he'd chosen his usual seat at the back of Mr. Perry's classroom, the other students drifted in and sat down without even considering his table. George believed he had the power to make himself invisible. It wasn't a real power, of course, but he liked that idea because most of the other kids ignored him and left him in the corner to write his stories. The school bell rang, and George's art teacher, Miss Paniski, poked her head in through the open classroom door. "Mr. Perry's late again. His car's broken down. Don't talk, don't move, and don't touch anything," she said, leaving as quickly as she'd arrived. George dove back into his notebook and the story he'd been working on. He'd started writing because something had happened last year. Something that made him long to escape to a far-off land, somewhere grief couldn't follow. Since then, George had become a professional thinker-upper of things. He'd been writing stories inspired by his grandfather's tales about the land of Mythica. It was a world quite different to his own, where creators fought the forces of evil by using their imaginations. George's birthday was on the 18th, and he was going to be a teenager. Something about that terrified him. He was growing up. It had seemed like such a big deal to reach double digits when he turned 10, but this was bigger, and somehow different. Growing up was making it harder to believe in Grandad's tales, and George wasn't ready to let go. He wasn't ready for the age of not believing, not yet. In fact, growing up seemed like an awful, terrible thing to happen to a person, and George didn't want to say goodbye to his happy childhood of magic and wonder. If becoming a teenager meant he couldn't believe in magic anymore, then he wanted to stay 12 forever. He didn't want things to keep changing, because the last time everything changed, he lost his dad forever. "Hello, George." George flinched. He was so lost in his story that he hadn't seen Neil Maynard approaching his table. Neil was a lanky boy with a face of bold freckles and a harsh East London accent. His voice was husky and rough, like splintered wood in need of sandpapering. Neil smirked, turning his attention to George's scribbled notes. "Still writing your stories, I see." George hunched over to obscure the pages from sight. Neil didn't care about his stories. The last time he'd shared one with the class, Neil had called it a load of rubbish. "Nobody writes with a pen anymore. You poor or something?" "I find it easier with a pen," George said. "I've been saving for a laptop to type them up. I've only got £80 to go." "Ah, well, I might be able to help with that." George straightened in his chair, narrowing his eyes suspiciously. "How?" "I'll give you £50. "Seriously? If—" There it was. The catch. George's shoulders sank. Nothing was ever that easy, especially when it involved Neil Maynard. "I'll give you 50 quid if you kiss Andre on the cheek." Andre Garcia was an older boy sitting at the front of George's class. He was 14 already, with pitch-black hair and brown eyes that sparkled. Andre's mother was from Iraq. He'd mentioned it in a presentation at the start of term. After being granted asylum in the UK and moving to London, she'd met his father, who had moved from Puerto Rico when he was still a boy. George wasn't sure why the memory of that had stuck, but everything he learned about Andre did. A sudden warmth in his cheeks told George he was blushing. He got to his feet abruptly to hide his face from Neil. Giving Andre Garcia a kiss didn't seem like such a big deal, but that didn't stop his palms from sweating. £50 was a lot of money, and George had already saved £220 for his laptop. With that 50, he'd only need another 30, and his birthday was only 5 days away. Christmas wasn't far off either. His great-uncle Bill always sent a card with money inside. Neil grew impatient. "Come on, £50, I dare ya!" George wanted that £50. He desperately needed that laptop. George ambled over to Andre's table, hovering briefly for a few moments as he tugged on the sleeve of his school jumper. He took a deep breath and planted himself in the vacant seat. It all happened so fast. The warmth of skin as his lips touched Andre's cheek, and Andre's stunned face as their eyes locked. "George kissed Andre, George kissed a boy," Neil yelled, announcing it to the class the way George would have called attention to a giant spider. That was when the laughter started. Cavernous, deafening laughter. George couldn't bring himself to look at Andre again. He made his way back to the table in the corner, the cackling around him fading to a thick, pulsating thump inside his head. The tears in George's eyes made his vision blurry as he reached Neil. He clenched his jaw. "Where's my money?" Seemed a silly thing to ask. He already knew the answer. "I'm not giving you anything, queer," Neil said, shoving him aside. Not all of his classmates were laughing. Some were just staring in silence. That was worse. This must be what it's like to be the frog in science class. It was as though his special powers had been stolen, and now everyone could see him. Maybe being ignored by everyone, being invisible, maybe that was better. George swallowed the lump in his throat as he picked up his fountain pen and turned to a new page in his notebook. The blank white page glared back, and he was overcome with a sudden emptiness. At lunchtime, George scooped shepherd's pie onto his plate, with a generous helping of crinkle-cut chips, and made his way through the canteen. Most of the seats at the tables around him were filled with other students, and many pulled their bags up to claim the empty chairs beside them. Whatever. George didn't want to sit next to them anyway. He was heading for an empty table in a corner. He preferred it that way. A lunchtime of meaningless gossip was an hour less spent on writing. George scribbled away in his notebook as he stole glances at Andre. He was sitting at a table on the other side of the canteen. George absorbed every detail. The dimples in his smile when his friends made him laugh, his animated brown eyes and those striking black eyebrows. George was still staring when Andre glanced over. Their eyes met briefly. George quickly buried his face in his notebook, and a sudden rush of blood in his cheeks made them tingle. The final class of the day was George's favourite subject, English literature. It was the one place he didn't get in trouble for writing. He was supposed to be listening to a lecture on Shakespeare, but his mind was somewhere else. George's other teachers had complained to his mother about him daydreaming in class. But that was all he wanted to do lately, to escape into one of Grandad's stories. After Neil's cruel prank, George just wanted to go home. When the school bell rang and the day was finally over, George took a shortcut home through the sports block. Turning a corner, he froze. It was Neil Maynard and his mates. But today they'd found someone else to pick on, a skinny Korean-American boy squinting nervously through his glasses. His name was Ty Hudson. George didn't know him well. He'd moved to England at the start of term. Neil shoved him against the wall and he dropped something. George could see it was a copy of a play by Thornton Wilder called Our Town. Neil and the other two boys hadn't spotted George yet. He still had time to turn around and find a safer route home. But that wasn't what the heroes that Grandad told tales about would do. George didn't really want to be the hero. Most of the time he needed one himself. But it wasn't right to walk away from someone in trouble. If it wasn't him today, it would be next time. Grandad's words echoed in his mind. There are terrible people who do terrible things, but to stand in the presence of darkness and do nothing, that is truly evil. Hey, leave him alone, George called out. Neil and his mean-looking mates turned towards him. Maybe this was a mistake. Their menacing faces made George want to stuff the words back in his mouth. Too late now. With their backs turned to him, Ty stepped forward. He pushed the tallest boy hard in the back, and the unexpected force sent him flying to the floor in front of Neil. Ty then shoved the stockier boy sideways, knocking him over too. Swiping the copy of his play off the floor, Ty gave George a brief nod as if to say, "Thanks," and dashed away. Neil didn't have time to do anything about it, and his anger quickly shifted to George. "Is Ty your boyfriend now or something?" George knew where this was heading, and it wasn't going to end well. He spun on his heels and sprinted off down the corridor. He hurled himself through the door of the sports block, but lost his balance and tumbled over. He grazed the palm of his hand on the tarmac, and the contents of his backpack spilled out. George scrambled to his knees to gather his things, but Neil was already towering over him. Neil narrowed his eyes and grabbed one of George's notebooks. Before George could stop him, he ran off with it. "No!" George yelled. "Not that notebook." George pursued Neil back inside, down the corridor and through the swinging door of the boys' toilets. He found Neil waiting. He was flicking through the pages with his mates sniggering behind him. "Once there was a boy whose father disappeared, and no matter where they looked, he was nowhere to be found," Neil said, reciting the words on the page in a cruel and mocking tone. "Give me back my story. It doesn't belong to you," George said, swiping at the notebook. Neil said, pulling it above his head and out of George's reach. George wasn't scared of Neil right now. Protecting his story was more important. Neil shrugged nonchalantly. "Nobody cares about your stories. They're all crap." He gave George a menacing sneer, ripped the pages out of the notebook. He entered the toilet cubicle nearby. "No!" George cried, lunging after him. Neil's cronies seized George by the arms, and he struggled frantically in their grasp. His heart was racing so fast it was making his body tremble, and his face burned with every beat of blood and adrenaline pumping through his body. Neil dropped the pages of George's writing into the toilet bowl. The ink ran instantly. Words snaked off the pages and slowly vanished into the water before Neil pulled the chain and flushed the soggy paper away. Neil left the toilet stall, and the two boys holding George let him go. He rushed over to the empty bowl and dropped to his knees, a sudden, sharp pain in his chest making him nauseous. His story was lost forever. George dragged himself to his feet and plodded out of the cubicle. He wished they'd just beaten him up. This was so much worse. Neil was there waiting for him, blocking his only way out. George clenched his fists as something monstrous took hold. It was like a volcano erupting inside him. He screamed and charged at Neil, shoving him through the swinging door. As they landed together on the floor outside, George punched Neil square in the nose. There was a brief snap, like a carrot breaking in two. "George Grimes!" It was their PE teacher, Mr. Marshall. With a flushed face, he marched down the corridor towards them in yellow shorts, far too small for his ginormous thighs. "What's going on here? What'd you do that for?" "It's nothing," George said. He didn't have time to explain. Mr. Marshall wouldn't believe him anyway. He never did. "George punched me in my nose," Neil said, his voice squeaking as he wept crocodile tears. "I think it's broken." "That's not nothing, George," Mr. Marshall said. "My office now. And you two, take Neil to the nurse and get that nose looked at." George trailed behind Mr. Marshall to his office and closed the door behind them. The small, dank room was more like a cupboard, and it smelled like sweaty pairs of socks. School tournament trophies and photographs lined the minimal wall space behind the corner desk. Mr. Marshall huffed. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence in this school. You know that, George." "You've got a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, but you let that happen," George muttered. "Excuse me?" George hadn't meant to say it out loud. Neil started it. "You never stop them hurting me on the playing field." "George, you hardly ever play. There's always an excuse or a note from your mother." He made it sound like some kind of awful crime. "Ever wondered why?" George said with a challenging glare. He wished he didn't have to beg his mother to write them either, but the truth was it was safer that way. It was pointless arguing with Mr. Marshall. George had been through this before. Mr. Marshall always took Neil's side, and it was obvious he would. Neil was captain of the soccer team and Mr. Marshall's protégé player. In his eyes, Neil Maynard could do no wrong. George didn't stand a chance. "Rugby's a rough game, but there's no excuse for punching someone off the pitch." "Whatever," George mumbled. He was too fed up to say anything else. He'd had quite enough of being blamed for things Neil Maynard had done to him. He just wanted to go home. Home from this terrible school with its terrible teachers and horrible students. George said nothing as he was given a yellow detention slip and another lecture about not answering back. It made 0 sense. The boy who daydreams, the boy who doesn't like playing rugby because it gets too rough, he's the bully. Typical. The only good thing about this whole situation was that school was over for the holidays. Detention would have to wait until after Christmas. George left Mr. Marshall's office and dragged his feet along the corridor towards his locker. It was all so unfair. Neil was the one who destroyed his story. Neil was the one who tricked him into kissing Andre. Neil was the one who deserved detention. George couldn't tell Mr. Marshall that, though. He would have dismissed his story being stolen. In fact, George was convinced Mr. Marshall would flush away anything bad that anyone ever said about Neil Maynard. When George turned the corner, he spotted a small white envelope wedged inside his locker. He checked around him. No sign of anyone. George half expected it to be a nasty note from Neil. He thumbed the corner of the envelope and ripped along the seam to reveal a birthday card. It was one of those black and white photos of 2 old men with an amusing speech bubble above it. Inside he found an anonymous handwritten message. Dear George, may your 13th birthday be everything you imagine, and more. It was signed with 2 initials, T.M. George didn't know anyone with a name that matched. He tucked the card into the pocket of his backpack and rescued the remaining contents of his locker. George lived very close to school, so his journey home didn't take long. Houghton Heath was a small town near the New Forest, a place where nothing much ever happened, and there wasn't very much to do either. There was no cinema, they didn't even have a library, which in George's opinion were 2 very essential things for all respectable towns to have. His grandfather had shared his disapproval. "A place without stories is not a place worth living in." Shepherd's Lane, the road he lived on, was at the end of a long alleyway next to a roundabout. Their house was number 7, a few doors up from the bottom of the hill. Neil and his mates often loitered at the end of the alleyway, so George clambered over the fence at the south end of the school playground to get home instead. He marched across his father's old vegetable patch, which was overgrown and falling into disrepair. George had been planning to tend to it himself, but he still wasn't ready. He'd spent a lot of time out there digging up soil and planting vegetables with his father. The ghosts of 1,000 conversations were still buried in those weeds. George accessed his back garden through a rusty wrought iron gate. When he entered the kitchen through the back door, he was just in time to catch the phone ringing. It was his mother. She'd been called in for an emergency shift in intensive care because of a pile-up on the motorway. He fixed himself a cup of tea and a peanut butter sandwich before making his way upstairs. His bedroom was a good size, with enough room for a desk to do his homework. At least, it was meant to be for homework. Instead, it was where he sat after school each day and did more writing. George upturned his backpack and a pile of notebooks tumbled onto his desk. He nibbled away on his sandwich and flicked through the pages carefully. Inside he found random notes, full of passages of text and other concepts he'd written down at school. One in particular caught his eye. It was from a strange new nightmare he kept having lately. A dark, destructive black fire surged out of the hands and mouth of the imposing armoured figure on the frozen lake. As it hit the surface, the ice cracked in sudden fractured webs beneath his feet and gave way, dragging him under. Freezing cold water pricked his skin like 1,000 needles as he sank and tried to push himself towards the surface. It was no use. The more he fought against it, the deeper into the darkness he fell. He was drowning and... That was all there was. George had not been able to write any more after Neil's interruption in the class earlier. He considered trying to write out the story that Neil had flushed away, but it would never be the same. He'd written it a year ago, after a memorial service they'd held for his dad. Neil had stolen the precious last memories of his father, the details George had been afraid of forgetting, and the cherished memories from his childhood before everything had changed. In the story he'd written, George was able to go back in time and stop his dad from leaving the house the morning the last time he saw him. If only he'd been able to do that. If only he'd been there to stop him. Maybe then his father would still be with them. Now, though, inventing a time machine seemed easier than reclaiming the words he'd just lost. On the wall of George's room were sketches, post-its and a couple of framed paintings of peculiar-looking creatures. The corkboard above his desk held a web of coloured string extending from a picture in the centre. Each piece of string was attached to a drawing pin, pulled tight to connect the other pictures. Under each image was a name. It was like the office of a detective solving a case. Something was different about the people on these walls, though. Only one person knew what had happened to them, and for now, they all lived inside George's head. George's mother had reminded him he needed to pack. They were going on an adventure tomorrow. At least, that's what he liked to call it. They were spending Christmas away from home this year, his mother had promised. They were going to the place George loved to visit most, to see the only person he felt truly understood him, his favourite person of all. They were going to Grandad's house.